Sign over your $2 million to my mom and give my sister the cottage, or it's divorce. I thought I was sitting down to a quiet Sunday dinner with my husband when he slid a legal document across the table and told me I had 48 hours to sign as away everything my grandmother had left me. I thought the man across from me was the person I had married 6 years ago. Steady, reasonable, the man who once held my hand through my grandmother's funeral and whispered that everything was going to be okay. I was wrong on every single count. What I didn't know yet, as the candle between us guttered in the draft from the open kitchen window, was that my husband, Daniel, had spent the last 3 months in secret conversations with his mother, crafting a legal strategy designed to strip me of a $2 million inheritance and a lakefront cottage that had been in my family for 4 generations. What I didn't know was that the man who kissed me goodbye every morning had already, in his private imagination, spent every dollar of my money, and what I absolutely could not have guessed was that by the time 48 hours were up, it would not be me signing anything. It would be Daniel explaining himself to a family law attorney while his mother sat in a waiting room, trying not to make eye contact with the security guard. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, to the warm, ordinary life I thought I was living, to the woman I was as before I understood what the people closest to me were truly capable of. My grandmother, Eleanor Marsh, was the kind of woman who made every room she walked into feel like it had been waiting specifically for her. She was 79 when she died, small and sharp-set and smelling faintly of lavender and the linseed oil she used to polish the furniture in the lake house. She had survived a difficult first marriage, built a modest real estate portfolio entirely on her own, and raised my mother, largely alone, after my grandfather walked out in 1971. She was not a soft woman, but she was a fair one. She kept her promises. She wrote things down. I was her only grandchild, and she told me more times than I could count that everything she had built was for me. Not because she spoiled me. She absolutely did not. But because she believed in continuity. She believed that what you built with your hands and your sacrifices should stay in the family, should be cared for, should mean something to the person who inherited it. When she passed in early March, 2 years after I married Daniel, she left me the lakefront cottage in Clearwater, a property her own parents had built in the 1940s. And that had been expanded and lovingly maintained ever since, and a liquid estate of approximately $2 million spread across investment accounts, savings, and a small, commercial property she had sold in the final year of her life. The will was unambiguous. Her attorney, a meticulous woman named Patricia Hollis, who had handled my grandmother's affairs for 15 years, had made sure every line was airtight. The estate cleared probate in under 4 months. I remember the afternoon I sat in Patricia's office and signed the final transfer documents. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings that day, the small ones she had given me on my 18th birthday, and I cried a little over the paperwork, even though I tried not to. Patricia handed me a box of tissues and told me my grandmother had been very proud of me. It was one of those moments that felt like a door closing and another opening simultaneously, a grief and a beginning folded together. Daniel was kind that day. He drove me home afterward, stopped at the little bakery we liked, brought me coffee and a slice of the lemon cake my grandmother had been fond of. He held my hand on the center console and said, "She would want you to be happy." He seemed genuinely to mean it. That is the part that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. Not the betrayal itself, but how convincing he was in the moments before it. We had a good life, or what I believed was a good life. We lived in a 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, about 40 minutes from the lake. I worked as a senior project manager for a healthcare software company, a job I had built over 8 years. Daniel was a landscape architect with his own small firm. We weren't wealthy before my inheritance, but we were comfortable. We took one real vacation a year, usually somewhere warm in February. We had friends we liked. We cooked on Sundays and argued mildly about whose turn it was to clean the bathroom. Daniel's family was a different texture from mine, but I had made my peace with that over the years. His mother, Beverly Ashton, was a woman in her early 60s, with dyed auburn hair and the manner of someone who believed herself to be more sophisticated than her circumstances warranted. She wasn't cruel exactly, not in those early years. She was prickly. She had opinions about my cooking, my career, my decision not to have children yet, delivered with the particular gentleness of someone who believes their opinions are actually favors. I had learned to let her talk, to smile at the appropriate moments, to change the subject when I needed to. Daniel's sister Krista was 31, unmarried, perpetually between jobs and relationships, and constitutionally incapable of managing money. Beverly adored her in that particular, exhausting way that mothers sometimes adore their least stable children, with a fierce protectiveness that occasionally tipped into enabling. I had never disliked Krista. I had just noticed over the years that she had a habit of looking at other people's things the way a person looks at the last piece of cake on a plate, calculating whether they could reach it before anyone noticed. The lake house, I understood later, had been the object of Krista's attention for a long time. The first sign that something had shifted came about 6 weeks after the estate transferred to my name. We were at Beverly's house for a Sunday dinner when Beverly, her back to me as she lifted a serving bowl from the counter, said quite casually, "Daniel mentioned the cottage might sit empty most of the year. Such a shame, a property like that not being used." "We use it," I said. "We went up in May. We're planning to go again in the fall." "Of course," she said, turning with the bowl and giving me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I just mean, for a property that size, it seems like a lot to maintain for just occasional weekends." I didn't answer. I carried the salad bowl to the table and filed the comment away as Beverly being Beverly. I had always had a strategy for her opinions, which was to simply not engage with them. I saw no reason to change it. But the comments continued. At Krista's birthday dinner in July, Beverly mentioned that Krista had always loved the lakes and had such beautiful memories of visiting with Daniel when they were children, as if my grandmother's property had somehow been a site of Ashton family memory rather than Marsh family history. At a backyard gathering in August, she asked whether I had thought about the tax implications of holding a vacation property, with a concerned tone of someone's raising an important practical matter rather than probing for information about my finances. I mentioned these conversations to Daniel once in the car on the way home. I kept my tone neutral, more observational than accusatory. Daniel's response bothered me more than the original comments had. He was quiet for a moment, eyes on the road, and then he said, "She's just making conversation, Claire. You know how she is." The words were reasonable. The tone was slightly too careful, slightly too quick. The tone of someone who has prepared a response rather than arriving at one naturally. I noticed it the way you notice a flicker in the corner of your eye, there and gone before you can look directly at it. The next sign was Daniel himself. He started working late 2 or 3 evenings a week, which was not entirely unusual for his business. But when he came home on those evenings, he was different in a way I struggled to name. Not distant exactly, but careful, like a person who was thinking hard about how to be normal. There were moments when I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between guilt and calculation. And then the expression would smooth over, and he would say something ordinary, and I would think I had imagined it. He also started asking questions about my finances that felt different from before. We had a joint account for household expenses and separate accounts for everything else. An arrangement we had made before we married and never revisited. He had never in 6 years shown particular interest in my personal accounts, but now in the evenings, he would bring up the inheritance in oblique ways. Did I have an advisor looking after the investments? Had I thought about whether it made more sense to hold things jointly rather than separately for simplicity? "It might be worth looking into," he said one evening in that careful tone. I didn't look into it. Something about the conversation made me want to leave things exactly as they were. The evening everything changed was a Wednesday in late September. I had come home from work at my usual time, changed out of my work clothes, started a pot of pasta on the stove. The kitchen smelled warm and ordinary. Garlic, olive oil, the faint smell of the herbs on the windowsill. Daniel had texted that he would be home by 7. He came in at 6:40 and he was not alone. Beverly was with him. She was wearing what I had privately come to think of as her official outfit. The dark blazer, the pearl necklace, the low heels, the outfit she wore when she was performing a version of herself she considered impressive. Daniel had the careful face on. He was carrying a manila envelope. "I was hoping we could talk," Beverly said with her company smile. I turned down the burner and sat at the kitchen table. Beverly sat across from me. Daniel sat beside his mother. I noticed that specifically, not beside me. "We've been thinking," Beverly said, folding hers on the table in a way that was meant to look composed and managed to look rehearsed, about the future, about family, about what makes sense going forward for everyone. "Go on," I said. Daniel slid the manila envelope across the table toward me. "It's a proposal," he said. "A legal proposal. We've had it drawn up by an attorney." I looked at the envelope and did not touch it. "What kind of proposal?" Beverly leaned forward with the expression of someone explaining something to a person who might not follow it easily. "Krista has been struggling. You know that she's been struggling for a long time, and as a mother, it's very difficult to watch. The cottage, your grandmother's cottage, it's sitting mostly empty. It has so much potential, and Krista has always had such a connection to that area, such a love for the lake. We thought it might be a beautiful solution to transfer it to her. It would give her a foundation, a start." I looked at Daniel. "You want me to give Krista my grandmother's lake house?" "We think it would be good for everyone," Daniel said. He was looking at the table, and the envelope. Beverly answered before Daniel could open his mouth. "The investments are a slightly more complex matter. I've had some medical expenses this year, significant ones, and Daniel and I have discussed it at length. We both feel that in a marriage, assets should be shared. The money your grandmother left you is family money now, and family takes care of each other." I opened the envelope. Inside was a document, 12 pages stapled with a law firm's header I didn't recognize. I read the first page slowly. It was a voluntary asset transfer agreement. My name at the top, Daniel's name, Beverly Ashton's name. The subject line printed in clean 12-point font read, "Transfer of real property, Clearwater Lake Cottage and investment assets, $2 million approximate value." There was a signature line at the bottom of the last page with my name typed beneath it. I put the document down carefully. I set it on the table in front of me with both hands, as if it were something that might break. My pulse was very loud in my ears. The kitchen still smelled like the pasta I had been making, and the smell was suddenly strange to me. The smell of a life that had been entirely normal 20 minutes ago. "You want me to sign over $2 million to Beverly," I said, keeping my voice very quiet, "and give the cottage to Krista." "We want what's best for the family," Beverly said. "Daniel." I said his name like a question. He finally looked up from the table. His expression was complicated. Something that might have been shame, something that was definitely calculation. And underneath both of those, something that frightened me more than either. Resignation, as if he had already accepted an outcome I didn't know was being decided. "It's just a proposal," he said. "We wanted to put it in writing so it was clear. You paid an attorney to draft this, Claire." "When did you pay an attorney to draft this?" I heard my own voice, steady and precise in a way that surprised me. Something was happening inside me that I didn't fully understand yet. A stillness at the center of a tremendous noise. "We should discuss it calmly," Beverly said, with a particular condescension of someone who believes that any reaction other than immediate agreement constitutes a loss of composure. "I am calm," I said, and I was completely terribly calm. "I am sitting at my kitchen table, looking at a document that your son helped you draw up, asking me to give away my grandmother's estate. I am as calm as I have ever been in my life." There was a silence. "I need you both to leave," I said. "Claire, we really should," Daniel started. "I need you to leave my house. I need to think. You will have an answer by Friday." Beverly's composure cracked briefly, and I saw the real face beneath it. Not wounded, not sad, but tight and cold and calculating. Then she smoothed it back over and stood. "Of course, take the time you need," as if she were granting me a favor. Daniel paused in the doorway. He looked at me with that complicated expression. "Claire, go," I said. He went. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after they left. The pasta boiled over on the stove and I didn't get up to turn it off. The smell of burned starch filled the kitchen, and I sat there in the middle of it and thought very carefully in the way you think when something fundamental has shifted and you know you are deciding who you are going to be. I thought about my grandmother, the way she had polished that furniture year after year, the smell of linseed oil that clung to her hands, what she had built and what she had intended, and what she had told me more than once about the people who would come for what you had if you let them see you wouldn't fight for it. She had not left me that cottage for Krista Ashton. She had not spent 50 years building a modest estate so that her granddaughter could hand it over to a woman she had never met, because that woman's son had a weak spine and a calculating mother. I picked up my phone and called my father. My father, Robert Marsh, was a 62-year-old retired engineer who had an absolute genius for two things: structural problems and reading people. He had never quite trusted Daniel, never in an expressed way, but in the small, careful way of a man who has learned that the people who will betray you are usually the ones you wouldn't expect. He picked up on the second ring. "Dad," I said, "I need to tell you something." I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a brief silence, and he said, "Do you still have Patricia Hollis's number?" Patricia Hollis, my grandmother's estate attorney, the meticulous woman who had made the will airtight. "Yes," I said. "Call her first thing tomorrow, tonight. Take pictures of that document and email them to yourself. Don't let it out of your house. Daniel will come back for it," I said. "Let him ask for it." My father said he won't. He was right. Daniel did not come back that night. He sent a text at 10:30 that said he was staying at his mother's and that he hoped I had time to think, and that he loved me. I read the message twice and put my phone face down on the nightstand and lay in the dark for 3 hours, thinking about the 12 pages in the manila envelope and the signature line at the bottom with my name printed beneath it. I did not sleep, but by the time the sky began to lighten, I had a plan. Patricia Hollis called me back at 8:15 the next morning with the calm briskness of someone who had heard difficult things before and knew how to think through them. I read her the relevant sections over the phone. There was a brief silence. "Who drew this up?" she asked. "Alderman and Gray," I said, reading the header. "I know them," she said in a tone that conveyed exactly nothing. "Bring that document to my office this afternoon." In Patricia's office, an hour later, she read the document all the way through without speaking. Her expression did not change. She was the kind of person who had trained her face not to react until she decided what to say. "This is sloppily drafted," she said. "Alderman and Gray are not real estate attorneys. It wouldn't have survived a challenge, even if you had signed it. The cottage transfer, in particular, has chain of title issues they clearly didn't research." She set it down. "Which raises the question of what they thought would happen. They thought I would just sign it." I said yes, she said. "They built their entire strategy on the assumption that you were the type of person who would be pressured by your husband and mother-in-law into compliance without seeking legal advice." She looked at me. "That reason no longer applies." But there was more. Patricia had done research before I arrived. She had found a filing with the county assessor's office made 6 weeks earlier. A title inquiry on the Clearwater cottage submitted under Daniel's name as a prospective co-owner, requesting information on the process for adding a spouse to an existing property deed. He had been planning to get me to add him to the deed first, use that joint ownership as leverage. The voluntary transfer to Krista would come second. Beverly would be paid from the liquid assets. It was, Patricia said, not an unusual scheme in divorce-adjacent situations. The kind of thing attorneys see when one spouse receives a significant inheritance and the other is positioning themselves before a potential separation. "He was planning to leave me," I said. "It was not quite a question. The inquiry was made 6 weeks ago," Patricia said carefully. "What I can tell you is that someone was thinking several steps ahead." She folded her hands. "The first thing you do is nothing. You do not sign anything. You do not confront anyone. You let them believe you are still deciding. Then you call Susan Garrett. She is a family law attorney and she is excellent. I called Susan Garrett from the parking lot. She had a cancellation at 40. Her office was on the fourth floor of a downtown building, and she was a compact woman in her 50s with dark hair, going silver at the temples, and the manner of someone who had heard everything and was no longer capable of surprise. I told her the full story without omitting anything. She asked 3 questions. What was the current title on the lake house? What was the structure of our joint versus separate financial accounts? Had Daniel raised the question of children or major financial decisions recently, in ways that seemed retrospectively like he was building a record? I answered all 3. The cottage was titled in my name alone. Our accounts were primarily separate, and yes, Daniel had raised the question of having children twice in the past 6 months, in a way that felt less like genuine conversation and more like documentation. In this state, inheritances received by one spouse are separate property. Susan said, a voluntary transfer agreement has no legal effect without your signature. Your assets are not at risk from the document itself. She paused, but I want to raise something. The title inquiry Patricia found was 6 weeks ago. What is Daniel's behavior toward you since then? He's been very careful, I said slowly. Every conversation feels managed. Then on Friday, Susan said, give him his answer. I spent Thursday going through the motions of my workday, answering emails, sitting in meetings, making the appropriate contributions, while a parallel track in my mind ran through the same sequence. What I knew, what I was going to do. That evening, my father came over without being asked, carrying takeout from the Thai place I liked, and an expression that said he was not going to pretend everything was fine. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and I talked through everything Patricia and Susan had told me. He listened and ate his curry, and did not offer opinions that weren't asked for, which was one of the things I had always loved about him. He thought you wouldn't fight, my father said when I finished. Apparently, he's known you for 8 years, my father said with quiet 8 years. He thought I would keep the peace, I said. I've been keeping the peace for a long time. My father looked at me for a moment. Your grandmother would be furious. I know. She was very specific with me when she was sick, he said. She told me she wanted to make sure that if you were ever in a difficult situation, you had options. She used that word options. I thought about the pearl earrings, the smell of linseed oil, the way she had looked at me across the table at her last birthday dinner, and said as if telling me the most important things she knew. Claire, never give anything away because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. Give things away because you want to or don't give them away at all. I'm not giving it away, I said. My father nodded once, as if that settled something. I need you to be here Friday evening, I said. I need a witness. Friday morning, Daniel texted to ask if we could talk that evening. I replied that yes, we could, and that I would be home by 7. I did not mention that my father would also be there. My father was already at the house when I arrived. He had let himself in with the spare key I had given him years ago and was sitting in the armchair, reading something on his phone. He looked up when I came in and nodded once, and I nodded back, and we didn't need to say anything else. Daniel arrived at 7:15, slightly late, and he was not alone. Beverly was with him again. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same chair, the same October evening, visible through the window. My father was in the living room, visible from the kitchen doorway. Daniel clocked him immediately. I watched his face shift through surprise and then recalibration, the careful face coming down like a shutter. Beverly's eyes went to my father and then to me. This is a family conversation, she said. He's my family, I said. Sit down. Beverly sat. Daniel sat beside his mother again. My father appeared in the doorway and stood there with his arms crossed and said nothing at all. I've had time to think, I said. You asked me for an answer by Friday. I have one. Good, Beverly said with the bright, expectant manner of someone who has decided the outcome in advance. The answer is no, I said to all of it. The cottage stays with me. The investments stay with me. I will not be signing the document you had drafted, which was reviewed by an attorney. who found it both legally insufficient and in a few specific respects potentially actionable. The silence in the kitchen was very complete. Beverly's bright manner drained away like water through a crack. "Claire," Daniel said, "we should talk about this privately." "We're talking about it now. I want your mother here for this because what I'm going to say concerns her directly." Daniel's jaw tightened. Beverly's eyes narrowed very slightly in the way of someone who is beginning to understand that a situation they believed they controlled has slipped. "I know about the title inquiry at the county assessor's office. I said the one filed 6 weeks ago under your name, requesting informations on the process for adding a spouse to the cottage deed. I know that was the first step in the strategy. Get me to add you to the deed and then use that joint ownership to facilitate the transfer to Krista. I know that the document you brought me 2 nights ago was the second step." Daniel was very still. "I've spoken to 2 attorneys in the past 48 hours, I continued. One is my grandmother's estate attorney, who has practiced real estate law for 30 years and found your document to be sloppy and legally inadequate. The other is a family law attorney who has advised me on the full scope of my rights and options." Beverly made a sound, something between a scoff and an intake of breath. "You've been talking to lawyers behind our backs." "You brought a lawyer's document to my kitchen table," I said. "What exactly did you expect?" "We were trying to help this family," Beverly said, and the faint tremor in her voice was not genuine emotion. It was a practiced register, the tremor meant to signal wounded feelings and redirect the conversation toward her suffering rather than her scheme. I had heard it many times. I was no longer moved by it. "Beverly," I said, "I would like you to listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to say this once." I placed my hands flat on the table and looked at her directly. "You have spent the last 6 months asking questions about my finances and my property in ways you thought I wasn't noticing. You and Daniel drew up a document in secret with an attorney I wasn't informed of, designed to transfer my grandmother's estate to you and your daughter. You presented that document to me as a family proposal when it was in reality an ambush. And when I told you I needed time to think, you assumed that time would be enough to wear me down." Beverly opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," I said. "You assumed that I would behave as I have always behaved, that I would keep the peace, that I would find a way to accommodate what you were asking, because it was easier than fighting. You built your entire strategy on that assumption, and that was your mistake." The kitchen was very quiet. Daniel spoke first, and what he said surprised me. Not because it was unexpected in content, but because it contained, for the first time that I could remember, something that sounded like the beginning of truth. "I thought," he said slowly, "that it was just money, that it would make things easier. Mom is really struggling, and Krista has nothing, Claire. She's been living in her car for 2 months. This was new information. I sat with it. "That's terrible," I said. "It genuinely is, but it doesn't change what you did." "I know," he said. Beverly stood up. She had recovered her composure with remarkable speed and was wearing her official expression again. Dignity and grievance simultaneously. "This has gotten completely out of hand. I came here in good faith, Beverly." My father's voice came from the doorway, quiet and final. He had not spoken for the entire conversation, and his silence until that moment had carried its own weight. "Please sit back down." She looked at him. Something in his face, that quiet, unbending stillness, made her hesitate. She sat. "My daughter has been more than fair," my father said, walking into the kitchen to stand beside my chair. "She has given you both a chance to tell the truth and an opportunity to avoid consequences that I suspect neither of you has fully thought through. A family law attorney who is aware of an asset transfer attempt that coincides with a title manipulation inquiry has a number of options. An estate attorney who has been given copies of documents drafted by another firm and asked to review their legality has a number of options. These are not threats, they are facts." Beverly's composure developed a very small crack at the corner of her mouth. "What do you want?" Daniel said, looking at me. He sounded tired. The exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and can feel it about to land. "I want honesty," I said. "The full picture. When did you first consult Alderman and Gray?" Have there been any other filings I don't know about? And what exactly is the situation with your mother's finances? What came out over the next 2 hours was the full shape of something that had been forming in the dark for almost a year. Beverly had first approached Daniel the previous November, 3 months before my grandmother died, while she was still ill. But the outcome was clear enough that people were making plans. Beverly had debts, poor investment decisions in retirement, money borrowed from a private lender at unfavorable terms, approximately $80,000 in personal debt. She had not told Daniel the full amount. She had told him she had significant expenses and that Krista's situation was worsening. Daniel's response, which he described in the measured tone of someone who knows what you're saying, cannot be defended but wants it on record anyway, was to think about the problem for several weeks and conclude that my grandmother's estate was the solution. He had told himself that $2 million was a lot of money, that his mother and sister needed help, and that I was the kind of person who cared about family and would agree if he built the case carefully enough. "You could have just talked to me," I said. "I didn't think you'd say yes. You were right. I said I wouldn't have, but you could have talked to me." He looked at the table. There was nothing to say to that. The title inquiry had been his idea. Beverly had wanted to go directly with the transfer document, but Daniel had recognized it wouldn't work without some form of joint ownership established first. He had filed the inquiry, gathered the information, and then stalled for several weeks. Beverly had grown impatient and pushed him to act, which was why the document had come to me when it did. The law firm was Beverly's contact, an old acquaintance of her ex-husband's, who did business law and had agreed to draft the document as a favor, which explained why it was so inadequately researched. No one had expected me to consult a real attorney. "What happens now?" Beverly said. Her voice had lost the official quality. She looked smaller than she had when she walked in. An older woman who had gambled on something she wasn't as certain about as she had told herself, sitting with the results. "That depends on Daniel," I said. I looked at my husband, the man I had married, the man who had held my hand through my grandmother's funeral, and built a careful, calculated plan to take everything she had left me. I looked at him and I thought about all the versions of this moment I had imagined over the past 72 hours. The angry version, the devastated version, the one where I said things I could not take back, and I settled on the one that felt most like myself. "I am not going to make any decisions tonight about this marriage," I said. "What I am going to do is the following. I am retaining Susan Garrett as my family law attorney effective immediately, and she will be your point of contact for any formal matters. I am having Patricia Hollis file a formal objection to the Alderman and Gray document with the county recorder, ensuring that any future title inquiries related to my property trigger a notification to her office, and I am taking the next 2 weeks to think about what I want without interference." "And my mother," Daniel said. "Your mother's debts are not my responsibility. I want to be very clear about that. If you choose independently to help your family with your own resources, that is your right. But my inheritance is mine, and my grandmother's cottage is mine, and no document and no conversation changes that." Beverly did not say anything. She was looking at her hands. They left at 9:30. My father made tea. We sat at the kitchen table without talking for a while, the October night, cold outside the window. "What are you going to do?" he said eventually. "I don't know yet," I said. "About Daniel, I genuinely don't know. About everything else, I know exactly what I'm going to do." The following weeks were the most exhausting of my life, and also, in a way I hadn't anticipated, some of the most clarifying. Susan Garrett filed the necessary protective documentation with Patricia's assistance. The county recorder's office flagged my property records. Any future inquiries would route through Patricia's office first. It was a small bureaucratic action, almost anticlimactic in its simplicity, but it felt like drawing a line in permanent ink around something that was mine. I called Krista myself in November, not because anyone pressured me and not as the result of any scheme, because she was a human being in a difficult situation, and I had the ability to help on terms that were mine alone. "I'm not calling about the cottage," I said when she answered with that particular weariness that told me she knew why she thought I was calling. A silence. "Okay," she said. "I'm calling because I know you're in a difficult situation," I said. "And because regardless of what your mother and your brother did, that's still true and it still matters. I'm not able to give you the cottage. That's not something that was mine to give, but I am willing to help you find stable housing as a loan and not a gift on terms that we agree to together." She cried, not performed crying, but the halting, surprised kind, the sound of someone who has been waiting for something and wasn't sure it would come. We talked practically and carefully about what help would look like and what it would not. I kept my word and she kept hers, and that is a separate story from this one. My marriage was over. That is the clean sentence, and it is the true one, even though the truth is more complicated. Daniel and I ended things formally in February after 3 months of couples therapy that had clarified rather than resolved what had happened between us. It was not a bitter ending. It was two people who'd chosen each other a long time ago and had then, somewhere in the middle of the stories, stopped choosing each other without saying so. The betrayal was real and the damage was real, but underneath it was a longer, quieter failure that predated the document and the strategy and the careful face. I did not hate him. I was not sure I would ever entirely forgive him, but I understood him finally in a way I hadn't during the marriage. Understood the particular weakness that had made him capable of what he had done, and understood that understanding it was not the same as excusing it. 6 months after that Friday evening in my kitchen, I drove up to the cottage alone for the first time. It was early April. The lake was still in that borderline state between winter and spring. The ice had gone, but the water was the deep cold blue of the season's end, and the birches along the shore had just started to show the faintest blur of green at their tips. The cottage was exactly as I had left it the previous fall. The porch railing slightly in need of paint. The dockboards still stacked from where I had pulled them for the winter. The third step from the top still creaking under my foot when I climbed it. My grandmother had never gotten around to fixing that step. She said it was useful that it told her when someone was coming. I stood on the porch for a long time looking at the lake. The morning light came off the water in the way it does in early spring, silver at the edges and gold in the middle, and the air smelled of cold water and turned earth and the particular cleanness of a place that has been waiting for you. My grandmother had been a woman who kept her promises. She had promised that what she built would stay in the family. She had promised that I would have options. She had promised that the things she gave me were mine to keep, as long as I was willing to keep them. I had kept them. She had built her whole life on a knowledge she had arrived at the hard way and had tried in her quiet, patient manner to pass down to me, that the things worth having are always the things someone else will try to take, that you are worth fighting for, and so are the things people tried to take from you. And the moment you act like you know, that is the moment they realize they were wrong about you all along. I went inside and opened the windows to let the spring air through, and put the kettle on and stood in my grandmother's kitchen looking at the lake. The water was very still. The birches were beginning finally to green. I poured my tea and sat down at the old wooden table my grandmother had owned since before my mother was born. In the quiet of the morning, with the light coming off the lake, and the third step still creaking the way it always had, I thought about what it means to still be standing somewhere you were supposed to have been driven from. There is a particular kind of strength in it, not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that sits at a kitchen table in the early morning and drinks its tea and knows, without needing to say it to anyone, that it won. Some things, once you have fought for them, stop belonging to the category of things that can be taken. They become a different kind of possession, not owned so much as inhabited, not held so much as known. My grandmother understood this. She had built it into the bones of this place. She gave me this. I kept